Hi, I'm Kate from Zen Stitching, and today I'm going to share with you a way to make a plastic-free brooch for Remembrance Day. We have a couple of different options that I'm going to share with you. One is how to make a stitched version where we're using the red fabric that we're going to stitch on top of. But you could also take the whole idea of what I'm going to show you and just use it all with embroidery thread. So I'm going to put below this video a link to how you can download this pattern so you can make your own and cut out the different shapes. And let's change camera angles and I'll show you how to make this step by step. So to create our poppy pin, we're going to need the following things. Some embroidery floss. I'm going to use a green for the stitching behind the poppy, some different reds for on the poppy, and some different blues for stitching around the edges of our poppies so that it keeps it looking somewhat neat. We're going to need a safety pin to create the pin on the back, a needle, something that's sharp so that you can stitch through 2 layers of fabric and has an open eye. I like to use a sashiko needle, but a crewel needle or a darning needle work equally as well. Some snips, a fabric marker, and then of course we're going to need our fabrics for the brooch itself. I'm using a piece of recycled denim, and I believe this is an old silk scarf that I'm going to create the poppy from. And of course we'll need a button to create that center of our flower as well. So let's begin. So the first thing I'm going to do is trace around my poppy shape, and you can download this below the video. And when I'm placing the shape on the fabric, I'm very mindful to make sure I'm utilizing the space on the fabric. So to give you an idea, I'm placing this as close to the edges as possible, which means that I've got more fabric left over as a whole to use for another project. And just very lightly with my fabric marker, I'm tracing around this shape. If you were using a fabric that was, say, somewhat stiffer, sometimes cottons can hold their shape a bit easier, you might be able to just pick up and cut around this shape rather than tracing it on first. But the tracing definitely does take away any of the guesswork. So there we can see the shape, and I'm going to cut this out with a pair of my fabric scissors, which are larger than the snips that I showed you in the beginning. So using the pinch method, where you pinch the thread between your fingers and then gently push it between or into the needle eye, I'm going to thread the needle, put a simple tailor's knot at the end there, and going to hide it between the 2 layers. So I'm putting my needle between the 2 layers of fabric and pulling it up so that the knot actually goes between those 2 layers of fabric. And then with the whip stitch, I'm going to wrap it around the 2 edges of the fabric. Now, because I've cut this fabric out with pinking shears, the chance of it fraying are less, but it's also just a nice process to get started with the project, sitting down and doing some stitching. And we're going to go all the way around the 3 edges that are trimmed. So I've got fabric, jean fabric on both sides, and this is because the folded fabric gives us a really nice soft quilted effect when we do our slow stitching on top of it. Finish off with a knot, and then I'm going to hide my thread inside the 2 layers and then cut off the excess. So that's step number 1. The second step is to come back in with our green thread to stitch these 2 layers of fabric together. This just gives us a really lovely tactile feel. So I've got just a nice soft green, and I'm looking to get probably about 1 meter of thread, which is the equivalent of a wingspan. So from your outstretched tip of your fingers to your opposite shoulder generally works out to be about 1 meter of thread. And the reason why we're working with longer threads at this point is because when we do our running stitch, we use quite a lot of thread in a short amount of time. So again, I'm going to see if there's a front and a back, and there's not really. Let's see, I do believe this is the front. So I'm going to pass my needle through the 2 layers there. This just means that again I'm hiding the knot in between the 2 layers of fabric, but of course this is personal preference, and if you want to have your knot showing at the back, that's totally okay too. So we've got my thread all set up, and I'm just going to do some running stitches up and down. Stopping every now and again and running my finger over it just to make sure I'm not gathering it too much. And because the denim is providing a little bit of resistance there, I'm using my table as a way of pressing the needle through the fabric and then pulling it through. Then when I get to the end, if you want to, you could hide your thread between the 2 layers. But again, it doesn't really matter. And then we can come back in and keep on going. Again, kind of putting my needle in between the 2 layers, and I'm doing that so that you don't see a crossbar at the top of each and every stitch row. And when you get to the end, all you need to do is put the needle between the 2 layers pull it through like that. Because it's not, it's just a decorative piece, we don't really need to worry about making sure it's too secure. So I can cut that off there, which means that we don't have a knot on either side. And just continue for one, probably 2 more rows. Now, because I only have a small amount to do, I'm going to measure how much I need, which is, I think I'm going to do probably space for 2 more rows. So I've got the length of 2 more rows plus a little bit extra for wiggle room. So there we have it. That's our fabric that has been quilted into place, and I just love this texture. So our next step is to place our poppy on the fabric, and then we're going to do a whip stitch around this edge here. The whip stitch is to help stop the edges from fraying. And I'm going to glue it down with just some regular old glue. You could, if you didn't have some glue, just use some pins to hold it in place. I find that the glue is helpful because it stops it from moving a bit, particularly when it's such a soft fabric. Okay, so making sure I'm happy with the placement of that. Going to pat that down and get my needle ready for the next step of stitching around the poppy. So making sure I've got a thread color that I'm happy with. I'm going to thread up my needle and do that same whip stitch approach around the poppy. And again, you can start and hide your knot between the 2 layers of fabric, and just working our way around the edges. So now that we've finished stitching around the edge, I'm going to turn it over and attach a safety pin to the back. So what we're looking to do is stitching along this edge here and attaching it to the fabric. So closing that again, we want to make sure it's centered. And the other thing too is, because it's going to be stitched on this top line here, we want to make sure that when we flip the pin up, it still is hidden behind this fabric here, because sometimes when we're wearing it, it's likely that this is going to drop a little bit. So I always like to err on the side of caution and double check that. So double check that we've got the right side, this edge that's not going to be undoable. Double check to go, yes, that looks good. Check by eye to make sure it's centered. And now what I'm going to do is, again, I'm putting my needle between those 2 layers of fabric. It's getting difficult now that there's loads of stitching. And this isn't that important anyway, even if you didn't want to do this part. I know I want my pin to go there. Just very gentle, pulling it through and up. So I know that it's not on either side of my fabric, pulling that through like so. So the first thing, just double check to make sure we've got the right side that we're stitching on. So the pin opening is to the bottom of the fabric. I'm going to put a few stitches around, just making sure it's not coming through the front, into that little loop there. And the reason for that is because when we're doing our stitching along here, it will have the potential to slide along a little bit. So this bit here just means it stops it from sliding back and forth too much. So then we're going to come in here, and this is where it takes a little bit of practice, a little bit of just making sure we're not accidentally putting our needle to the front of the work. So we're kind of operating in between the two layers of fabric. And again, we're going to use that whip stitch to hold it in place. So I'm just going very slowly, making sure I'm not stitching and putting the thread through the two layers, just this back layer of fabric. Putting that in and along. And doing this again. Making sure it's not on both sides. Pushing it through. And just a few stitches close to each other to end it at this far end. And again, we'll be running the needle through both layers of fabric to hide that end. The last thing we want to do is put a little button on for the middle of the poppy. So the piece de resistance is to sew on our button, which is going to be the center of the poppy. And for this we can, I'm just going to, let's see, going to line up my holes so that they're kind of square up and down. And then I've got a knot in my thread. And I'm going to do 3 or 4 lots of rounds or wraps, finishing with a knot again, passing the needle through the 2 layers of fabric. So, looking at this, I feel that I would like to put a round of stitches of just like this one around this center here, just to kind of give this poppy a little bit more depth. So this is where coming in and adding your own embellishments can be a lot of fun. I have 2 different types of red here, and I think I might choose the brighter of the 2, which is a different color to this outside, for this circle of stitches I'm going to do around the middle there. Pulling it through again so that the knots don't appear on the back, and just going by eye, going to create a whole lot of stitches that radiate out from that center button, that center point. Yeah. And there we have our poppy pin. It's only takes a couple of hours to make, so why not make one for you and then share them with your friends as well, and start a trend to encourage people to wear poppies in remembrance of all of those brave soldiers who fought for a better life. Share with your friends, share a poppy to encourage people to wear them, to remember the brave soldiers, and also to promote wearing a poppy that's not made from plastic. Hopefully this might spark some conversation around the idea of single-use plastics and some alternatives. Happy stitching! I hope you enjoyed watching today's video and had fun making your own plastic-free Remembrance Day poppy brooch. If you'd like to learn more, I'd love it if you subscribed or clicked like on the links below, and you can also find me on the socials. I'm at Zen Stitching at Facebook and Instagram, or you can find out more about all the different stitch programs that I run at zenstitching.ca. Wishing you many happy hours of creativity.